We have so far covered the process of creating geometry using the lab. What we haven't touched on yet was how to create modifiers. So I wanted to dedicate this video entirely to creating a modifier from scratch. And I wanted to do a simple modifier, nothing really complex, just so that we can get into it and use the same kind of skills that we got from making a geometry plugin, but apply it towards making a modifier instead. So let's just create a simple sphere, and then we can create a modifier that goes on top of it. So I'm going to go to the modifier panel, and I'm going to go to the drop down, and as I mentioned in the very first video, we have a geometry modifier option here, which is a template for lab modifiers. So if I click the geometry modifier, you can see a very familiar site, and that is a blank my input parameter, which doesn't really do anything. And we have our edit plugin button, which will start editing the plugin. But we also have a sphere disappearing, which means that basically the modifier is currently not outputting anything. And if I click on the edit plugin button, you can see that there is no outputs. Well, we have an output, but nothing really goes into the output. And then we have three inputs. One of the inputs is the add input, so it doesn't count. It's just used for adding new input ports. But the other two are more interesting. The my input is the same as the user interface here, so we use this to provide some kind of parameter for our modifier. But the more interesting is the very first input called mesh. And this input provides the mesh, the incoming mesh, which we're supposed to modify. And what this plugin accepts is the resulting mesh after we do something to our output mesh. So if we click on the mesh here and we drag it out and just drop it onto an empty space, we get something called a type value node. And a type value node is basically a node that takes some kind of object, in this case a polygon mesh, and exposes its properties to you. So if I click on this plus 16 hidden ports, you can see all the different outputs that a mesh object provides. In this case, we can see that there are normals and polygons and vertices and all the other good stuff that we will need to work on. The input mesh in this case is our sphere object. So let's just do something very simple and push the vertices of our sphere object away from the center of the coordinate system. Actually, to make it even simpler, let's first just create an output mesh that is exactly the same as the input mesh. So to do that, I'm going to use a mesh constructor as we did before. So I'm going to do polygon mesh, create, and it's going to create a blank polygon mesh node. And just to be very simple for now, let's wire the vertices output of this node, which we dragged out, into the vertices port, and let's drag out the polygon outputs into the polygon's input. And let's connect this output to my output, which is expecting a mesh object. So as an output now, we see that we have our mesh, and this is the same mesh that is incoming mesh. Essentially what we're doing here is we are copying the vertices and polygons directly from the source mesh into the destination mesh. And let's now do something with our vertices and push them away from the center. So to push the vertices away from the center, all I need to do is take every single vertex and multiply it by a certain value, and we can specify the value using my input. So let me add a multiply modifier, modifying a multiply node. And in this case, we cannot use the same multiply node as we did before, because both of these parameters are expecting the same type. So for example, if I set this parameter to vector3 type, both of these parameters now accept a vector3 input. But there is another multiply node, which is called multiply alternative, which is fourth option from the top. And if we create this one, this actually has two separate operands. So we can set this parameter to be one type and this parameter to be the other type. And this is exactly what we need in this case, because we want to multiply a vertex position by a single value. In this case, we want the user to let us specify the distance from the center, which is going to be a floating point value. So for now, let's take my input and assign it to the second value. And as you can see, only this value now has an assigned type float. The first one still has this arrow here, which means we can still wire another value type into this. And using this whole notion that we are able to pipe in an array of values into a single value, let's pipe in the vertices, which are vector3 array, into the value 1. And in this case, it's going to take all these vertices and it's going to produce for us a vector3 array, because it's going to multiply every single vertex in that array by our value to produce an array of results. So let's take the output and then put it into vertices input. Right now we don't see anything because we have my input set to 0, but as we start increasing the value for my input, we can see that the mesh actually changes, and it is doing exactly what we wanted, which is push the coordinate away from the center. So this kind of basically covers modifiers. You can obviously do a lot more complex things here, just like we did with generating a plane mesh, but we will cover generating something more interesting, more complex in the future. So this video was more to give you an overview of how you can create modifiers inside the lab.